Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand on the shore of your own country, knowing that by morning you might never see it again? Not because you wish to leave, not because you were chasing adventure, but because staying had slowly become impossible. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you would like, share your location and local time in the comments below. It is always interesting to see how many different parts of the world gather together here at night to listen to these quiet journeys through history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the spring of 1975, the long conflict that had divided Vietnam for decades came to an abrupt conclusion. For many years, the country had been split between two governments, one in the north and one in the south. Each side had its own political system, military forces, and international allies. The war that followed was complex and destructive, drawing in soldiers and civilians from across the country. By April of that year, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Northern forces had advanced steadily southward. Cities that once seemed secure were falling one after another. Refugees from rural provinces were arriving in the capital, bringing stories of changing conditions and uncertain futures. The southern capital, Saigon, had become a crowded and uneasy city. Government officials attempted to maintain order, while military commanders watched the situation unfold with growing concern. Markets remained open and traffic continued along the busy streets, but beneath the ordinary routines there was a strong awareness that history was moving quickly. On the 30th of April, 1975, the war effectively ended. Military vehicles entered the centre of Saigon, and the government of South Vietnam surrendered. The country would soon be unified under a single administration led from the north. The city itself was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City. For many Vietnamese citizens, the end of fighting brought relief. Years of conflict had taken an enormous toll. Families had lost relatives, farmland had been damaged, and entire communities had been displaced. Peace offered the possibility that rebuilding might finally begin, yet the conclusion of the war also meant the beginning of major political and social changes. The new government began reorganizing institutions across the south. Administrative systems were replaced with new structures based on socialist principles. Businesses that had once operated privately were placed under state management. Banks, factories, and large trading companies became part of the national economy. One of the earliest programs introduced after the war was known as re-education. Former officers of the South Vietnamese military, government officials, and individuals connected to the previous administration were instructed to report to special camps. At first, many believed these programs would involve only a short period of political instruction. In reality, some participants remained in these camps for extended periods of time. During their absence, families at home faced new challenges. Wives and children often had limited information about when their relatives might return. Without the income that those men had once provided, many households had to find new ways to support themselves. Meanwhile, the economic system was undergoing its own transformation. Before 1975, the cities of southern Vietnam had been centres of trade. Markets were filled with goods imported from neighbouring countries and produced by local businesses. Shopkeepers operated small stores that served particular neighbourhoods, and traders moved products through busy port areas. Under the new policies, the government introduced a more centralised system of distribution. Ration cards were used in some areas to manage the supply of basic foods and materials. Items such as rice, cooking oil, cloth, and soap were allocated according to household size. In addition to these economic changes, authorities also encouraged people living in crowded urban districts to relocate to what were called new economic zones. These zones were often located in rural regions that required development. Families who moved there were expected to clear land, plant crops, and establish new farming communities. Some individuals accepted these relocations with cautious optimism, believing that agriculture might provide stability. Others found the transition difficult. City residents who had spent their lives working in offices or shops suddenly faced the challenge of clearing forests and cultivating unfamiliar land. Throughout southern Vietnam, daily life was adjusting to a new political and economic landscape. For a number of citizens, the situation created a quiet sense of uncertainty. Those who had once worked closely with the former government sometimes worried about their future prospects. Business owners who had lost their enterprises wondered how they would rebuild their livelihoods. Families separated by re-education programs waited for news that often arrived slowly or not at all. During these years, the idea of leaving the country began to appear in quiet conversations. At first, the thought seemed almost impossible. Vietnam had been home for generations. Families maintained strong connections to particular neighborhoods, villages, and regions. Cultural traditions were deeply rooted in local temples, churches, and ancestral graves. Leaving such a place meant more than relocation. It meant stepping away from a long chain of memory. Yet the possibility continued to circulate. Some individuals had relatives abroad who had left during earlier periods of political upheaval. Others had heard stories about opportunities in distant countries where Vietnamese immigrants had begun to build new communities. But legal travel out of Vietnam was extremely limited during the late 1970s. Passports were rarely issued for ordinary citizens. International movement was closely regulated, and obtaining permission to leave permanently was very difficult. As a result, a different method of departure gradually emerged. In coastal towns and river communities, small networks of people began organizing secret journeys by sea. Many of these organizers were fishermen who knew the waterways of the Mekong Delta and the long southern coastline. Others were former sailors who understood basic navigation. A few possessed aging fishing vessels capable of travelling far beyond the shore. Word about these departures moved carefully from one person to another. A trusted friend might mention that a boat would soon be leaving from a certain village. Another acquaintance might explain that places were available, though only for those who could pay a substantial fee. The payment was not made in ordinary money. Instead, the price was measured in gold. Gold had long served as a form of savings in Vietnamese households. Families kept small bars or pieces of jewellery that could be exchanged during emergencies. To purchase a place on a boat, passengers were often required to give several taels of gold. For many families, this represented years of accumulated savings. In order to gather enough, people sold household items that had once been part of daily life. Furniture, bicycles, motorbikes, and sewing machines disappeared from homes as families quietly converted possessions into gold. Even after paying such a high price, the journey remained uncertain. Some boats were discovered before departure, and their passengers detained. Others simply failed to appear after collecting payment. Rumours circulated of vessels that had been poorly maintained or dangerously overloaded. Yet despite the risks, interest in these voyages continued to grow. By the late 1970s, more and more people were considering the possibility. Families often kept their plans secret, discussing them only with the closest relatives. Children were told little about the details, only that the family might soon travel by boat. The preparations were careful and quiet. Small bags were packed with clothing and a few personal items. Important documents were hidden among folded fabrics. Some families carried photographs of relatives or small religious objects that connected them to their past. When the night of departure arrived, the journey usually began in silence. Passengers travelled separately to remote docks or narrow riverbanks, arriving at different times to avoid drawing attention. Fishing boats waited in the dark, their outlines barely visible against the water. Once everyone had boarded, the engine would start slowly. The boat moved through the winding channels of the delta until it reached open sea. At that moment, the passengers understood that their lives had changed permanently. Behind them remained the towns where they had grown up, the markets they had walked through as children, and the homes where their families had gathered for generations. Ahead lay only water. The people who took these journeys would eventually become known throughout the world as the Vietnamese boat people. But at the beginning, they were simply individuals making one of the most difficult decisions of their lives. and as the coastline of Vietnam slowly disappeared into the darkness, the long chapter of their story had quietly begun. During the first years after the war ended in 1975, life across southern Vietnam slowly settled into a new structure. The fighting had stopped, but the transformation of society continued. Government offices introduced new policies, schools revised their curricula, and economic systems that had once relied on private businesses were reorganized under state direction. For many people, daily life became a process of adjustment. Cities that had once been lively centers of trade entered a quieter period. Shops that previously sold imported goods or specialized products gradually disappeared as nationalization expanded across different industries. Factories were reorganized under state management, and many workers were reassigned to different roles. Streets that had once been filled with advertisements and foreign brands began to look simpler. In markets across the South, vendors still sold vegetables, fish, rice, and household goods, but the selection was often smaller than it had been before the war ended. Families learned to plan carefully for the week ahead, stretching their supplies as efficiently as possible. Ration systems were introduced in some areas to ensure that basic foods were distributed evenly. Rice remained the foundation of nearly every meal. Small portions of vegetables, fish sauce, and occasionally fish or meat completed the diet when available. Many households adapted to these conditions with patience, drawing on long traditions of resourcefulness that had carried earlier generations through difficult times. At the same time, the government began encouraging large numbers of urban residents to move into agricultural development zones. These areas, often called new economic zones, were typically located in rural regions where forests or unused land could be cleared for farming. The policy was designed to reduce population pressure in cities while increasing food production for the country as a whole. Families who relocated to these zones travelled by truck or bus to areas that were sometimes far from the cities they had known all their lives. When they arrived, the landscape often consisted of open fields, patches of forest, and simple wooden structures. Work began immediately. Trees were cut down, fields were prepared, and irrigation channels were dug to bring water to the crops. People who had spent years working as clerks, teachers, shopkeepers, or technicians suddenly found themselves learning the skills of farming. Some adapted gradually, forming small communities where neighbours helped one another clear land and plant rice. Others found the transition extremely difficult. The soil was unfamiliar, tools were limited, and housing conditions were basic. Meanwhile, many families remained in the cities, where a different set of challenges unfolded. One of the most significant issues during this period was the absence of many men who had been connected to the former South Vietnamese government. Those who had served as officers, administrators, or civil servants were often sent to re-education programs shortly after the war ended. These programs were presented as opportunities for political instruction and national reconciliation. Participants attended lectures about the new political system and engaged in labour projects that ranged from farming to construction. For the families left behind, the waiting could be long. Wives managed households on their own, while raising children and caring for elderly relatives. Letters from the camps sometimes arrived after weeks or months of delay, offering brief updates about health or work assignments. The uncertainty surrounding these separations shaped the atmosphere of many communities during the late 1970s. At the same time, the broader economy of southern Vietnam continued to evolve. The shift towards state-managed trade reduced many opportunities for private entrepreneurship. People who had once operated shops or small businesses now had fewer ways to earn income independently. In response, a quiet, informal economy began to grow. Individuals traded goods quietly between neighbourhoods, exchanged items through personal connections, and repaired household equipment for neighbours in return for food or small payments. These activities were rarely organised openly, but they formed an important layer of everyday life. Another factor that shaped the period was the movement of people across the country. After the war, large numbers of Vietnamese citizens relocated to different regions as part of reconstruction efforts. Some travelled north for education or work assignments. Others moved south to help develop agriculture in newly opened areas. Railways, buses and riverboats carried passengers through a landscape that was gradually adjusting to peacetime conditions. Yet despite these efforts to rebuild and reorganize the country, a number of families continued to feel uncertain about their future. The reasons were rarely identical. Some worried about the long-term absence of relatives in re-education programs. Others struggled with economic changes that made it difficult to rebuild businesses or maintain previous standards of living. For people who had grown accustomed to a certain degree of economic independence, the new system required significant adaptation. Over time, these concerns began to shape quiet discussions among neighbours and extended families. The conversations usually took place inside homes, away from public attention. People spoke cautiously, often lowering their voices when mentioning sensitive subjects. One question appeared repeatedly: would life gradually stabilise, or would the challenges continue for many years? At first, most families hoped that conditions would improve with time. Vietnam had endured wars and upheavals throughout its long history, and earlier generations had always managed to rebuild their communities. Patience, many believed, would eventually bring stability. But as the late 1970s continued, a growing number of people began exploring another possibility: leaving the country. The idea was not new. Throughout history, Vietnamese merchants, scholars and labourers had travelled abroad for trade or work. Some had settled in neighbouring regions of Southeast Asia, forming small diaspora communities that maintained cultural connections to their homeland. What made the situation after 1975 unusual was the scale of interest. Instead of small groups of traders or students leaving temporarily, entire families were considering permanent departure. The challenge, however, was that official channels for emigration were extremely limited. Travel permits were difficult to obtain. Passports were rarely issued for long-term migration. Even when someone managed to leave legally for study or work, the process required years of approval. As a result, many people began listening carefully for rumours about other methods. In coastal regions, fishermen and sailors had long been familiar with the routes that connected Vietnam to neighbouring countries. The waters of the South China Sea linked the Vietnamese coastline to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. Fishing vessels travelled these waters regularly, sometimes remaining at sea for days at a time. Within this environment, a new form of migration gradually emerged. Small groups began organising secret departures using boats. These operations were rarely large or formal. Often they involved a single captain, a small crew, and a wooden fishing vessel that could carry dozens of passengers. Because the journeys were illegal, secrecy was essential. Passengers were instructed to arrive quietly at predetermined locations along rivers or coastal villages. Departure times changed frequently to avoid attention. Communication relied almost entirely on personal trust. The most difficult part of the arrangement was the cost. Boat owners demanded payment in gold, which was considered the most reliable form of wealth during uncertain times. For a family of 4 or 5 people, the total payment could represent nearly everything they owned. Many households sold furniture, tools, jewellery, and even their homes in order to gather enough gold for passage. The decision to do so was rarely taken lightly. Parents often spent months discussing the possibility with relatives. Some chose to send only one member of the family at first, hoping that person might later sponsor others to join them abroad. Others believed it was safer for everyone to travel together. Throughout this period, stories circulated quietly about people who had already attempted the voyage. A neighbour might mention that a cousin had reached Malaysia after several days at sea. Another might describe a distant relative who had been rescued by a foreign ship and taken to a refugee camp. These stories were often incomplete, but they carried powerful influence. They suggested that leaving Vietnam by boat, though dangerous, was possible. By the end of the decade, these quiet plans were becoming more common across coastal provinces and large cities alike. Families packed small bundles of clothing, important papers, and personal items that could fit into a single bag. Everything else remained behind. At night, in places where the river met the sea, boats began slipping away under cover of darkness. The passengers who boarded them carried many different hopes and fears. Some believed they would soon arrive safely in another country. Others expected the journey to be long and uncertain. What they shared was a willingness to face the open sea in search of a different future. And as more boats began leaving the Vietnamese coastline, the movement that would become known around the world as the Vietnamese boat people quietly expanded. The journey itself, however, was only beginning. The price of a seat. As the idea of leaving Vietnam quietly spread through neighbourhoods and coastal towns in the late 1970s, the most difficult step for many families was not deciding to leave, but finding a way to secure a place on a boat. These departures were not organised publicly. They existed within hidden networks that operated carefully to avoid the attention of authorities. The organisers were usually fishermen, former sailors, or traders who understood the coastline and possessed boats capable of travelling beyond the river deltas and into open sea. A typical vessel was not large. Most were wooden fishing boats originally designed to carry nets and small crews along coastal waters. Their engines were often old, sometimes repaired many times over the years. Yet these same vessels were now being prepared for journeys that might last several days or even weeks. Because the operation involved significant risk, those arranging the voyages demanded high payment. The price was measured in gold. Gold had long been used in Vietnam as a stable store of wealth. Families kept small bars or carefully weighed jewellery hidden in drawers or wrapped inside cloth. During times of uncertainty, gold could be exchanged quickly for goods or services. Boat organisers required these payments because they could not rely on ordinary currency, which fluctuated and might lose value. Gold, by contrast, could be traded anywhere. For a single passenger, the cost could be several taels of gold. A tael was a traditional unit of weight used throughout Southeast Asia. To many households, this amount represented years of savings. When multiplied by an entire family, the price became enormous. In cities like Ho Chi Minh City and smaller towns along the Mekong Delta, families began quietly selling possessions to gather the necessary gold. Furniture disappeared from living rooms. Sewing machines, which had once provided income through tailoring, were exchanged for small bars of metal. Bicycles, radios, watches, and other valuable items were sold to trusted buyers who understood the reason but asked few questions. Even after gathering enough gold, uncertainty remained. The networks arranging departures were not always reliable. Some organisers postponed trips repeatedly, claiming that weather conditions were unfavourable or that patrols were active along certain waterways. Others accepted payment and then disappeared. Yet many operations did succeed. Word of successful departures spread carefully between relatives and friends. A neighbour might mention that a distant cousin had reached Malaysia after travelling for several days. Another might describe how a family from a nearby district had arrived safely in Indonesia. These stories were rarely confirmed in detail, but they encouraged others to attempt the journey. The preparations for departure were always conducted quietly. Families packed only what they could carry easily. Clothing was folded tightly inside small bags. Important documents such as birth certificates, school records, and family photographs were wrapped in waterproof materials. Parents often struggled with what to bring and what to leave behind. Large belongings had already been sold. Remaining household objects, tables, cooking pots, religious altars, could not be taken onto crowded boats. They stayed behind in empty rooms that might soon belong to new occupants. In many cases, neighbours were unaware that a family planned to leave. To maintain secrecy, households continued their daily routines until the final day. Children attended school as usual. Adults visited markets or workplaces just as they had before. Only a few trusted relatives knew the truth. When the evening of departure approached, instructions were usually very specific. Passengers were told to arrive at different times and sometimes by different routes. This prevented large groups from gathering in a single place where they might attract attention. The meeting points were often remote sections of riverbank, quiet fishing docks, or narrow channels hidden among mangrove trees. The Mekong Delta, with its vast network of waterways, offered many such locations. After sunset, small groups moved through the darkness carrying their bags. Lanterns were rarely used because light could reveal their presence from a distance. At the edge of the water, the boats waited. Some vessels were already crowded when new passengers arrived. Families found narrow spaces along wooden benches or on the deck where they could sit close together. The boat crews worked quickly, loading supplies such as fuel containers, drinking water, and sacks of rice. Once everyone had boarded, the engines were started quietly. The boats moved slowly through narrow channels of the delta, guided by captains who knew the rivers well. Their goal was to reach open sea without being stopped along the way. During these early hours, most passengers remained silent. They understood that discovery could lead to arrest or confiscation of the boat. In some cases, people had already experienced such failures during earlier attempts. Yet even when the boat reached the open sea successfully, the journey was far from safe. These fishing vessels had not been designed for long-distance travel with dozens of passengers. Overcrowding was common. Boats built for a crew of 10 might now carry 50 or more people. Space was extremely limited. Passengers sat shoulder to shoulder, often unable to stretch their legs for hours at a time. Bags of rice and containers of water were stacked wherever there was room. Food was simple. Rice was cooked in small pots over portable stoves when weather allowed. Occasionally dried fish or preserved vegetables were shared among families. Water had to be rationed carefully. Engines consumed fuel steadily, and once the voyage began, there was no reliable way to obtain more. Navigation was another challenge. Many captains possessed only basic equipment, sometimes just a compass and knowledge of the stars. Their goal was usually to reach the coastline of another Southeast Asian country, where refugee camps had begun accepting arrivals. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Hong Kong were among the most common destinations. The distance to these places varied depending on the route. Some journeys required several days of travel across open water. Weather conditions could change quickly in the South China Sea. Strong winds and waves sometimes forced boats to slow down or change direction. Rainstorms reduced visibility and made navigation more difficult. Despite these obstacles, departures continued. The people who boarded these boats understood that the voyage would be dangerous, yet they also believed that remaining behind might bring years of uncertainty. For many families, the decision had already been made long before they stepped onto the wooden deck. They had sold their possessions, gathered their gold, and said quiet farewells to relatives who would remain. What lay ahead was unknown, but as the coastline of Vietnam gradually disappeared behind them, and the sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the passengers realized that their lives had entered a new and uncertain chapter. The world would later recognize them by a simple name: the Vietnamese boat people. Departure into the sea. By the time a boat finally left the winding rivers of southern Vietnam and entered the open sea, most of the most difficult decisions had already been made. Passengers had sold their possessions, paid large amounts of gold to organizers, and quietly said goodbye to relatives who remained behind. Once the shoreline faded into darkness, there was no possibility of turning back. The journey would continue forward until land appeared again, somewhere beyond the horizon. The boats used for these journeys were usually small wooden fishing vessels. Many had been built years earlier for short coastal trips rather than long-distance travel. Their hulls were narrow, and their engines were often repaired repeatedly over time. Yet these boats now carried far more passengers than they had originally been designed to hold. A vessel that normally supported a fishing crew of 10 might now hold 40 or 50 people. Some boats carried even more. Passengers sat tightly together along wooden benches or on the deck. Personal bags were stacked in small piles wherever space could be found. Movement was limited. If one person shifted position, several others often needed to adjust as well. Families stayed close together, trying to maintain a small area that belonged to them during the long hours ahead. The air on the boat changed noticeably once it left the rivers behind. Inland waterways were sheltered by trees and riverbanks, but the open sea brought stronger winds and rolling waves. The surface of the water stretched endlessly in every direction, reflecting sunlight during the day and darkness at night. For many passengers, it was the first time they had ever travelled far from land. Some individuals had grown up in coastal villages and were familiar with fishing boats, but others had spent their lives in cities or inland towns. The constant motion of the sea quickly made some passengers uncomfortable. Seasickness was common during the first days of the journey. People leaned over the sides of the boat while waves lifted and lowered the vessel again and again. Crew members tried to keep the deck clear and maintain balance while the engine continued its steady sound. Food on board was simple and carefully rationed. Most boats carried sacks of rice as the main supply. Small stoves or metal cooking pots allowed the crew to prepare rice when conditions were calm enough. Occasionally, dried fish or preserved vegetables were distributed among the passengers. Meals were brief. Each person received a small portion, enough to maintain energy but not enough for comfort. Water was also distributed in measured amounts. Fresh drinking water was stored in large containers that had been loaded before departure. Because the length of the journey was uncertain, passengers had to conserve every drop. Some boats attempted to collect rainwater when storms passed overhead. Cloth or plastic sheets were held open to catch falling rain, which was then poured into bottles or containers. The captain and crew focused on navigation. Their destination was usually one of the refugee reception areas that had begun to appear in neighbouring countries. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Hong Kong were among the places where boats sometimes arrived. The distance to these destinations varied widely. Some boats travelled only a few hundred kilometres before reaching land. Others drifted much farther across the sea if weather conditions or navigation errors pushed them off course. Most captains relied on basic tools. A compass provided direction, and knowledge of regional winds and currents helped guide the route. Some sailors used the position of the sun during the day and the stars at night to maintain orientation. Mechanical problems were always a concern. Engines that had already been used for years sometimes struggled under the strain of long travel. Fuel supplies had to be managed carefully to avoid running out before reaching shore. Crew members checked the engine regularly, listening for unusual sounds or vibrations. When minor repairs were needed, tools were brought out, and adjustments were made while the boat continued moving slowly across the water. During the daytime hours, passengers often looked toward the horizon. The sea created a vast and unfamiliar environment. Waves moved steadily beneath the boat, and the sky stretched wide above them. Children sometimes asked their parents when land would appear. Most adults could only answer with quiet reassurance. Time on the boat moved differently than on land. Without clocks or fixed schedules, passengers measured time by the movement of the sun and the passing of day into night. Morning light gradually brightened the sea, while evening brought cooler air and fading visibility. At night the conditions were quieter. The engine continued its steady rhythm, and the waves reflected small patches of starlight. Some passengers rested while sitting upright, leaning against relatives or bags of supplies. Others remained awake, listening to the sounds of water against the wooden hull. The uncertainty of the journey was always present. No one knew exactly how long the trip would last. Some boats reached foreign coastlines in a few days. Others drifted for much longer periods when winds slowed their progress or when navigational mistakes carried them away from expected routes. Another concern was the presence of patrol vessels. Governments in the region monitored their waters closely. Some refugee boats were turned away from coastlines and forced to continue searching for another place to land. For the passengers aboard these small vessels, such encounters added another layer of uncertainty. Yet despite these risks, many boats continued travelling successfully across the South China Sea. As the late 1970s progressed, increasing numbers of refugees arrived on the shores of neighbouring countries. Local authorities, humanitarian organisations, and international observers began noticing the steady flow of arrivals. News reports described families stepping onto beaches after days at sea. Some were exhausted but relieved to have reached land. Others arrived with damaged boats, their engines failing just as the coastline came into view. In several countries, temporary refugee camps were established to receive these arrivals. These camps provided basic shelter, food, and medical attention, while international organisations determined what would happen next. For passengers still travelling on the open sea, however, those camps remained distant possibilities. From the deck of a crowded fishing boat, the world consisted mainly of water, sky, and the quiet hope that land would eventually appear ahead. Each morning, passengers scanned the horizon. A faint line on the edge of the sea might signal the approach of an island or coastline. Sometimes clouds formed shapes that resembled land, only to disappear as the boat moved closer. But eventually, for many of these vessels, the moment arrived. A distant shoreline emerged from the horizon. For passengers who had spent days surrounded only by water, the sight of land carried enormous meaning. It suggested that the long journey across the sea might soon come to an end. Yet reaching land did not always mean immediate safety. The next stage of the journey would begin there on unfamiliar shores, in crowded refugee camps, and within a complex international system that would determine where these travellers might eventually settle. For now, however, the small boats continued moving steadily across the sea, carrying families whose lives had already changed in ways they could never fully predict. Storms and drifting days. Once the small boats moved far enough from the Vietnamese coastline, the passengers entered a part of the journey where the greatest challenges often began to appear. The open sea brought a level of uncertainty that few people on board had experienced before. During the first day or two after departure, many boats travelled steadily under relatively calm conditions. The engines pushed the vessels forward at a slow but constant speed, and the captains focused on maintaining the correct direction across the water. The passengers adjusted to the confined space of the deck, and slowly became accustomed to the movement of the waves beneath them. But the South China Sea is a large and active body of water, and conditions could change quickly. Winds sometimes strengthened without much warning. Small waves that had once moved gently across the surface could grow into larger swells that lifted the boats up and down in steady rhythms. When this happened, the wooden hulls creaked as they rose and fell against the water. For vessels carrying dozens of people, balance became very important. Passengers were often instructed to remain seated in particular positions so that the weight of the boat stayed evenly distributed. Crew members walked carefully across the deck to check ropes, fuel containers and supplies. When storms appeared on the horizon, the atmosphere on board shifted quietly. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, and the wind carried cooler air across the sea. The captain usually adjusted the direction of the boat slightly to face the waves more directly, reducing the chance that strong currents might push the vessel sideways. Rain often arrived suddenly. Heavy drops struck the wooden deck and soaked clothing within minutes. Some passengers covered their heads with cloth or plastic sheets. Others simply remained still, allowing the rain to pass. At times, rainwater provided a small advantage. Crew members and passengers sometimes placed bowls or containers on the deck to collect fresh water. The gathered rain could supplement the limited drinking supply stored in large barrels, but storms also brought serious risks. Strong waves occasionally washed across the deck, forcing passengers to hold tightly onto railings or ropes. The boats themselves were not built for heavy seas, and their narrow shape made them vulnerable to large swells. The captains navigated carefully, slowing the engines when necessary and waiting for the worst weather to pass. Storms were not the only difficulty. Mechanical failures sometimes interrupted the journey. The engines used on many refugee boats had already served years in fishing operations. When pushed to operate continuously across open water, parts could wear down quickly. Fuel lines occasionally clogged, cooling systems overheated, belts loosened or broke entirely. When this happened, the crew gathered around the engine compartment and attempted repairs using whatever tools were available. Passengers watched quietly while the boat drifted slowly with the currents. Sometimes the repairs succeeded quickly. In other cases, the engine refused to restart. When a vessel lost power completely, the situation became far more uncertain. Without propulsion, the boat moved only according to wind and ocean currents. The direction of travel could no longer be controlled, and the passengers had little ability to determine where they might eventually drift. For people on board, these drifting days could feel long and unpredictable. The horizon remained empty of land in every direction. The sky changed slowly from morning brightness to afternoon heat, and then to the fading light of evening. Food and water supplies became even more important in such moments. Crew members carefully counted the remaining sacks of rice and measured the level of water inside the containers. If the journey lasted longer than expected, the daily portions had to be reduced. Passengers adapted by eating small meals and conserving their energy. Many people remained seated for long hours to avoid unnecessary movement. Children stayed close to their parents, sometimes sleeping through much of the day. Despite the hardships, passengers often tried to maintain quiet routines that made the time pass more smoothly. Some families organised small tasks, such as cleaning parts of the deck or assisting the crew with simple duties. Others spent time looking across the sea, watching birds that occasionally appeared above the water. Seabirds were sometimes a hopeful sign. Their presence suggested that land might not be far away, since many birds rarely travelled far from coastal regions. Yet the sea often remained empty for days. Another challenge during these voyages was the intense heat of the tropical sun. During midday hours, the sky above the South China Sea could become very bright, and the wooden decks absorbed the warmth quickly. Passengers used cloth, hats, or pieces of plastic to create shade where possible. Some boats carried small canvas covers that could be stretched across part of the deck. These provided limited shelter from both sun and rain, though space beneath them was extremely crowded. The evenings often brought cooler air. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the light across the water softened and the heat of the day faded gradually. Many passengers found these hours more comfortable. Night also offered moments of quiet reflection. With the engine running steadily and the waves moving beneath the boat, the surrounding sea became calm and dark. Above, the sky revealed large numbers of stars that were rarely visible in city environments. For captains and experienced sailors, these stars sometimes served as guides. By observing their positions, navigators could confirm whether the boat continued moving in the correct direction. For the passengers, however, the stars were simply part of the unfamiliar landscape that now surrounded them. Some individuals rested during the night while others remained awake. The long hours allowed people to think about the homes they had left behind. Families remembered streets, markets, schools, and familiar neighbours who were now far away. At the same time, attention always returned to the present journey. Every morning brought the same quiet question. Would land appear today? The sight of another ship on the horizon occasionally interrupted the routine of the voyage. Large cargo vessels and fishing fleets operated throughout the South China Sea. When refugee boats encountered them, the passengers sometimes waved or signalled in hopes of assistance. Responses varied. Some ships continued their course without stopping. Others approached cautiously, offering water, food, or directions before moving on. Encounters with other vessels were unpredictable, but they reminded the passengers that they were not entirely alone on the sea. As the days passed, many boats eventually returned to steady travel, after repairs were completed or weather conditions improved. The engines resumed their constant rhythm, and the captains focused once again on reaching the nearest coastline. Yet another challenge awaited many of these travellers in the waters ahead. In certain parts of the region, particularly near the Gulf of Thailand, refugee boats sometimes encountered groups that were not interested in offering assistance. These encounters would become one of the most feared aspects of the journey. For now, however, the small vessels continued their slow progress across the open sea, carrying families who had already travelled far from the rivers where their voyage had begun. Pirates in the Gulf. As refugee boats continued travelling across the waters of the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand during the late 1970s, many captains and passengers gradually became aware of a danger that had little to do with storms, mechanical failure, or drifting currents. The danger came from other boats. These vessels were not part of international rescue efforts, and they were not fishing boats offering assistance. Instead, they were operated by groups that had learned that refugee vessels often carried people who possessed valuables. The passengers had paid for their journey with gold, and although much of that gold had already been handed over to the organisers of the voyage, some refugees still carried small amounts of jewellery or hidden savings. Rings, necklaces and coins were sometimes kept as emergency resources in case the journey lasted longer than expected. Word about this spread across the region. By the end of the 1970s, certain areas of the Gulf of Thailand had become known as places where pirate attacks occasionally occurred. These pirates were not part of large organised fleets. Most were small groups of men operating fishing boats or motorised vessels who had discovered that refugee boats were slow, crowded, and largely defenceless. The refugee vessels themselves had little ability to escape. Their engines were often weak and overloaded with passengers. Their crews were small, and the people aboard were families carrying only personal belongings. When a faster boat appeared on the horizon and began moving closer, the passengers often realized quickly that they could not outrun it. The approach sometimes began quietly. A distant boat might appear as a small shape far across the water. At first it could resemble an ordinary fishing vessel, which was a common sight in the region. Fishing fleets operated throughout the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea, and many refugee captains initially hoped that an approaching boat might simply be fishermen passing nearby. But when the vessel changed direction and began heading directly toward the refugee boat, the situation became clearer. The engines of the approaching craft were usually stronger and faster. Within a short period of time, it could move alongside the slower refugee vessel. At that moment, the passengers understood that they were facing a situation they could not easily control. Pirate groups typically boarded the refugee boats directly. They climbed across the sides or stepped onto the deck once the vessels were close enough together. Some carried knives or firearms, though in many cases the presence of weapons was not even necessary. The refugee passengers were already aware that resistance could be dangerous. The first demand was almost always the same: valuables. Pirates searched the passengers for anything made of gold or silver. Jewellery was removed from wrists, fingers and necks. Small bags were opened and examined carefully. Many refugees had already attempted to hide their remaining valuables before the voyage began. Some placed jewellery inside clothing seams or wrapped small items inside layers of cloth. Others buried coins beneath bundles of food or placed them in containers that appeared ordinary. But pirate groups had experience with these methods. They inspected bags, clothing, and personal belongings methodically. Passengers were often required to hand over anything that appeared valuable. In many cases, the robbery lasted only a short time. The pirates took the items they wanted and then returned to their own boat before leaving the refugee vessel drifting on the water. But the situation did not always end so quickly. Reports from survivors later described incidents in which pirates remained on the refugee boats for longer periods, searching repeatedly for hidden valuables or taking supplies such as food and fuel. These losses could create serious problems for the refugees. Food reserves were already limited, and losing sacks of rice or containers of water meant that the remaining passengers would have to ration their supplies even more carefully. Fuel theft was equally dangerous. Without enough fuel to power the engine, a boat could drift for days without direction. International humanitarian organizations later documented hundreds of such encounters across the region. The Gulf of Thailand became particularly well known for pirate activity during this period because many refugee boats travelled through those waters on their way toward Malaysia or Thailand. As the number of departures from Vietnam increased, the number of vulnerable vessels at sea increased as well. For the passengers aboard these boats, the possibility of encountering pirates added another layer of uncertainty to an already difficult journey. Captains tried to reduce the risk when possible. Some attempted to travel along less common routes. Others left the Vietnamese coastline at times when fewer boats were expected to be operating nearby. But the sea is wide and unpredictable, and it was impossible to avoid every potential encounter. Passengers often watched the horizon carefully throughout the day. Any distant shape moving across the water attracted attention. If another vessel appeared to be approaching too quickly or directly, the atmosphere aboard the refugee boat changed immediately. Crew members sometimes attempted small adjustments to the boat's course, hoping to avoid the approaching craft. Yet, in many cases, these efforts made little difference. The refugee boats were simply too slow. Despite these dangers, the voyages continued. Families had already invested everything they owned into the journey. Turning back was rarely an option, and many boats had already travelled too far from the Vietnamese coastline to consider returning. Instead, Passengers endured the uncertainty with patience. They focused on the routine tasks of the voyage, maintaining supplies, caring for children, and assisting the crew where possible. Days passed slowly as the boats moved through different regions of the sea. Weather patterns shifted, and currents carried the vessels across wide stretches of water. Sometimes seabirds appeared overhead, suggesting that land might not be far away. Other times the horizon remained empty for long periods. When pirate encounters did not occur, the passengers experienced brief moments of relief. Each day that passed without trouble meant that the boat had moved farther from the most dangerous areas. Eventually, many vessels crossed beyond the Gulf of Thailand entirely and entered waters closer to the coastlines of neighbouring countries. At that point, a different question began to occupy the thoughts of those on board. Would the approaching countries allow them to land? Throughout Southeast Asia during the late 1970s, governments were struggling to manage the sudden arrival of large numbers of refugees. Some coastlines accepted boats and directed passengers toward refugee camps. Others attempted to prevent new arrivals because their own resources were limited. For the people on the boats, however, reaching any shoreline offered hope. After days or weeks on open water, the appearance of land meant that the long and uncertain sea journey might finally be approaching its end. From the deck of a crowded fishing boat, the first glimpse of a distant island or coastline carried enormous meaning. The sea that had surrounded them for so long was beginning to give way to land again. First land after the sea. For the passengers who had spent days or sometimes weeks on crowded wooden boats, the first sight of land was often quiet rather than dramatic. The horizon, which had remained empty for so long, gradually changed shape. A faint dark line appeared between the water and the sky. At first it could easily be mistaken for a cloud, but as the boat moved closer, the line slowly developed form. Small hills might appear in the distance. Clusters of trees became visible along the shoreline. Occasionally the outline of buildings or fishing huts emerged against the sky. For the passengers on board, this distant land signalled the end of the open sea. But reaching it did not mean that the journey was finished. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, several countries across Southeast Asia became destinations for refugee boats leaving Vietnam. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the British territory of Hong Kong all received significant numbers of arrivals. Each region responded differently, depending on its resources, political conditions, and international agreements. For the refugees themselves, however, the immediate concern was simply reaching the shore safely. Many boats approached the coastline cautiously. Captains reduced the engine speed as they navigated shallow waters where reefs or sandbars could damage the hull. The sea changed colour near the shore, becoming lighter as the water grew shallower. Waves broke more frequently as they rolled toward the beach. Sometimes local fishermen noticed the arriving vessels first. Fishing communities were common along many parts of Southeast Asia's coastlines. Boats operated daily in nearby waters, and fishermen occasionally spotted refugee vessels approaching slowly from the distance. In some cases, they guided the boats towards safer landing points. In others, they simply watched from a distance as the unfamiliar craft moved closer to shore. When a refugee boat finally reached land, the passengers stepped onto unfamiliar ground. After so many days surrounded only by water, even the simple act of standing on solid earth felt unusual. Legs that had remained cramped on the deck for long periods needed time to adjust again to walking. The condition of the passengers varied. Some individuals arrived tired but otherwise healthy. Others showed clear signs of exhaustion from long days at sea. Sun exposure, dehydration, and limited food had taken their toll during the journey. Children were often among the most vulnerable passengers. Long hours in crowded conditions could weaken them quickly, especially if water supplies had run low during the voyage. Local authorities typically became involved soon after a boat arrived. Coast guards, police officers, or regional officials were responsible for determining how the new arrivals would be handled. By the late 1970s, the number of refugee boats reaching Southeast Asian shores had increased significantly, and governments were under pressure to manage the situation carefully. Temporary holding areas were often established near the landing sites. These areas allowed officials to register the new arrivals and provide immediate assistance such as food, water, and medical attention. From there, most refugees were transported to larger refugee camps that had been created to accommodate the growing population. For the passengers who had survived the sea journey, the transfer to these camps represented the next stage of their lives. Many of the largest camps were located on islands. Pulau Bidong in Malaysia, Galang Island in Indonesia, and several camps in Hong Kong and the Philippines became well-known destinations for Vietnamese refugees during this period. These islands were chosen partly because they provided space separate from major cities. Governments hoped that isolating the refugee population would make it easier to manage resources and maintain order. Transportation to the camps usually occurred by boat. Smaller vessels carried groups of refugees from coastal landing areas to the designated camp islands. During these short journeys, passengers often experienced mixed emotions. The relief of having survived the sea voyage remained strong, yet the future beyond the camps was still uncertain. When the refugees first arrived at these camps, they encountered a landscape very different from the cities and villages they had left behind. Many camps consisted of simple structures built quickly to accommodate large numbers of people. Wooden huts, canvas tents, and temporary shelters formed rows across the islands. International humanitarian organizations worked alongside local authorities to provide supplies. Groups such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the Red Cross played important roles in organizing food distribution, medical care, and administrative registration. Despite these efforts, conditions in the camps were often crowded. Some camps received far more refugees than planners had originally expected. Pulau Bidong, for example, eventually held tens of thousands of people on a relatively small island. The shelters were tightly packed together. Narrow paths connected different sections of the camp. Communal water points and sanitation areas served large numbers of residents. Food was distributed through organized systems that ensured each person received a basic portion. Daily life quickly developed routines. Refugees lined up for meals at scheduled times. Water collection points operated throughout the day. Medical clinics treated illnesses and injuries that had developed during the sea journeys. Children gradually returned to something resembling normal childhood activities. Informal schools appeared in some camps where volunteers taught basic lessons in reading, writing, and mathematics. These classes helped children continue their education while waiting for the next stage of their journey. Adults spent much of their time waiting. The refugee camps were not intended to be permanent settlements. Instead, they served as temporary locations where international authorities could evaluate each refugee's situation and determine possible resettlement options. This process often took months and sometimes years. Officials interviewed families to document their backgrounds and determine whether they qualified for refugee status under international law. Records were created for each person, including information about their previous residence, family members, and education. At the same time, representatives from various countries visited the camps. Governments from nations such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and France participated in programs that allowed refugees to be resettled abroad. For the people living inside the camps, the possibility of resettlement offered hope for the future. Yet the waiting period could be long. During these months and years, refugees attempted to rebuild daily life within the limited environment of the camp islands. Small markets appeared where residents exchanged goods or prepared simple meals. Religious gatherings were organized in makeshift temples or churches. Community leaders helped maintain order and resolve disputes. Even within the crowded conditions, a sense of community slowly developed among the refugees. Many had experienced similar journeys across the sea, and shared experiences created strong connections between families. The sea voyage itself, however, remained a defining memory. Passengers often remembered the long days on crowded boats, the uncertainty of drifting across open water, and the relief of seeing land appear after so much time at sea. Those memories formed the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Life on the refugee islands. Once the refugees had been transported from the shorelines of Southeast Asia to the larger camps on nearby islands, their lives entered a period defined by waiting. For many people who had survived the sea voyage, the first days in the camps brought a sense of relief. The dangers of storms, mechanical failures, and pirate encounters were now behind them. They had reached land, and for the first time in weeks they could sleep on solid ground. Yet the camps were not places of permanent settlement. They were temporary communities created quickly to handle the arrival of large numbers of refugees. As a result, conditions were often basic and crowded. Some of the best-known refugee camps were located on small islands. Pulau Bidong in Malaysia became one of the most heavily populated camps during the peak years of the boat people migration. Galang Island in Indonesia also received many arrivals, as did several camps in Hong Kong and the Philippines. These islands were chosen partly because they provided a controlled environment where governments could manage refugee populations while international organizations arranged long-term resettlement. When new refugees arrived, they were registered by camp authorities. Officials recorded names, family relationships, ages, and the details of each person's journey. This information helped humanitarian agencies track arrivals and organize future resettlement interviews. After registration, families were assigned living spaces. The shelters varied depending on the camp. In some areas, refugees lived in wooden huts built close together along narrow pathways. In other sections, canvas tents were used, especially when large numbers of arrivals exceeded the available structures. Space inside the shelters was limited. Families often shared small rooms with several members sleeping side by side on simple mats or wooden platforms. Personal belongings were kept in bags or small containers placed against the walls. Despite these crowded conditions, many refugees worked hard to create a sense of home within their temporary surroundings. Some families hung cloth or blankets to divide sleeping areas. Others arranged small cooking spaces just outside their shelters where rice could be prepared over simple stoves. The camp environment gradually developed its own daily rhythm. Early in the morning, many residents lined up at water stations to collect drinking water for the day. Containers were filled carefully and carried back to the shelters. Food distribution followed a scheduled system. Rice remained the main staple provided by aid organizations. Additional supplies such as vegetables, fish, or canned goods were distributed when available. Each family received a portion based on the number of people registered in the household. Cooking often took place in communal areas. Smoke from small cooking fires rose above the rows of shelters as families prepared simple meals. Despite limited ingredients, many refugees recreated familiar Vietnamese dishes using whatever materials were available. Meals provided moments of routine and connection. Families gathered together to eat, sharing food and conversation after long days of waiting. Medical services were another important part of camp life. Clinics operated by international humanitarian groups treated illnesses that had developed during the sea voyages. Dehydration, infections, and nutritional deficiencies were common among new arrivals. Doctors and nurses worked continuously to provide care. Vaccination programs were also introduced to prevent outbreaks of contagious diseases, which could spread quickly in crowded environments. Children gradually formed a large portion of the camp population. For them, life on the islands created a childhood unlike any other. Many had little memory of the homes their families had left behind in Vietnam. Their world now consisted of rows of shelters, dusty pathways, and the sound of waves breaking against nearby shores. To provide structure for younger refugees, volunteers organized informal schools. These classes were often held in simple wooden buildings or under open shelters, with roofs for shade. Teachers included educated refugees, as well as volunteers from international organizations. Students learned reading, writing, mathematics, and sometimes foreign languages that might help them in future resettlement countries. Education became an important source of hope. Parents believed that learning new skills would help their children adapt more easily when they eventually moved to another country. Adults in the camps faced a different challenge. Their days contained long periods of waiting. After food distribution and household tasks were completed, Many hours remained without clear purpose. People walked along the narrow paths of the camp, visited neighbours, or gathered in small groups to discuss news and rumours about possible resettlement. Information about the outside world travelled slowly. Occasionally, newspapers or radio broadcasts reached the camps, bringing reports about international discussions concerning refugee resettlement programs. These reports were closely followed by camp residents. Different countries were beginning to accept refugees under organised immigration programs. Representatives from these nations sometimes visited the camps to conduct interviews with families. The interview process was an important step. Officials asked questions about each refugee's background, education, family connections, and reasons for leaving Vietnam. The information helped determine whether the individual qualified for refugee status and which country might accept them. For many refugees, receiving approval for resettlement meant the possibility of starting a completely new life. However, the process often required patience. Some families waited months before receiving interview invitations. Others remained in the camps for several years before their applications were processed. During these long periods, camp communities continued to grow. Small markets developed where residents traded goods or services. Some refugees repaired clothing, prepared food for sale, or crafted small items that could be exchanged for supplies. Religious life also remained important. Temporary temples and churches appeared in different sections of the camps. Residents gathered there for prayers, ceremonies, and quiet reflection. These gatherings helped maintain cultural traditions that had travelled with the refugees across the sea. Despite the difficult conditions, many camp residents worked together to maintain order and cooperation. Community leaders emerged naturally within the population. They helped organise activities, resolve disputes, and communicated with camp administrators about concerns or needs. The sense of shared experience strengthened these communities. Nearly everyone living on the islands had endured a similar journey across the sea. They had faced overcrowded boats, uncertain navigation, and long days surrounded by water. Those experiences created a bond that extended beyond family ties. Even so, life in the camps remained temporary. The ultimate goal for most refugees was resettlement in another country, where they could build permanent homes and rebuild their lives. Each time a family received approval for departure, the news spread quickly through the camp. Neighbours gathered to offer congratulations and assistance with final preparations. The departing families packed their few belongings once again, preparing for another journey, this time by airplane rather than boat. For those who remained behind, the departure of others served as a reminder that their own opportunity might come soon. The refugee islands had become places of waiting, but they were also places of transition. Every week, new arrivals stepped onto the shore after surviving the sea voyage, and every week other families departed for new countries far across the world. Between those two movements, life continued quietly among the shelters, classrooms, clinics, and narrow pathways of the camps. And while the sea that surrounded the islands had once represented danger and uncertainty, it now marked the boundary between the refugees' past in Vietnam and the unknown future that awaited them beyond the horizon. The long years of waiting. For many Vietnamese refugees who arrived in camps across Southeast Asia, the journey across the sea was only the beginning of a much longer period of uncertainty. Once the immediate relief of reaching land had passed, life on the islands settled into a rhythm, shaped by patience and endurance. The refugee camps had been designed as temporary places where people could stay while international organisations arranged their future resettlement. But the number of arrivals continued to grow throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, and the process of resettlement could not always keep pace. As a result, thousands of refugees remained in these camps for extended periods. Some stayed for only a few months before receiving approval to move to another country. Others lived on the islands for several years. In rare cases, families spent nearly a decade in the camp system before finally leaving. The camps themselves continued to evolve as the population increased. At Pulau Bidong in Malaysia, the number of residents rose dramatically during the peak years of the boat people crisis. What had once been a small island with limited infrastructure quickly became a densely populated settlement filled with wooden shelters, narrow paths, and communal facilities. Every available space was used. Shelters were built close together, sometimes separated by only a few feet. Walkways connected different sections of the camp, forming networks of narrow lanes where residents moved between their homes, food distribution centers, schools, and clinics. Despite the crowded conditions, the refugee communities slowly created organized systems that allowed daily life to function. Community leaders emerged among the residents. Some had previously been teachers, civil servants, or local officials in Vietnam. Others gained respect through their ability to communicate with both the refugees and the camp administrators. These leaders helped maintain order within the camps. They organized work groups to clean common areas, manage water collection points, and assist new arrivals who had just reached the island after long journeys at sea. The presence of these leaders made it easier for humanitarian organizations to coordinate their assistance programs. Food distribution remained one of the most important daily activities. Aid organizations delivered rice, canned goods, dried fish, and occasionally vegetables to the camps. Volunteers and community members helped divide the supplies into portions that were distributed to each registered household. The system required careful organization. Large groups of people lined up with containers or bags to receive their share of the daily ration. The process was repeated several times each week, depending on supply deliveries. Cooking took place near the shelters. Small charcoal stoves were commonly used, and smoke often rose from different sections of the camp during meal preparation. Even with limited ingredients, families recreated familiar dishes from Vietnam whenever possible. Meals provided moments of stability in an otherwise uncertain environment. Children continued attending the informal schools that had been established earlier. Education became one of the most valued aspects of camp life. Parents believed strongly that schooling would help their children succeed once they eventually settled in another country. Teachers worked with limited materials. Chalkboards were sometimes the only teaching tools available, and students shared textbooks when they could be obtained. Lessons were conducted in Vietnamese, but also included basic English or French, depending on the expected destination countries for resettlement. The classrooms were often simple wooden structures with open sides that allowed air to circulate in the tropical heat. Despite these modest conditions, students attended regularly. For many children, school provided structure and purpose during years that might otherwise have been defined only by waiting. Teenagers and young adults often took on additional responsibilities within the camps. Some assisted teachers in classrooms. Others volunteered at clinics or helped distribute supplies. These roles gave younger residents opportunities to contribute to the community while preparing for future lives beyond the islands. Medical services remained essential. Doctors and nurses treated a wide range of conditions among the refugee population. Many patients suffered from illnesses related to the difficult sea voyages they had endured. Dehydration, infections, and respiratory problems were common during the first weeks after arrival. As time passed, the clinics focused increasingly on routine health care. Vaccinations were provided for children, and prenatal care was offered for pregnant women. Medical teams monitored sanitation conditions carefully to prevent outbreaks of contagious disease. Maintaining public health in such crowded environments required constant attention. Sanitation facilities were expanded as the camp populations grew. Water purification systems were installed to ensure that drinking water remained safe. Camp residents themselves played an important role in these efforts. Work teams cleaned communal areas and repaired shelters that had been damaged by storms or heavy rain. Maintaining these structures was necessary because the tropical climate could be harsh on wooden buildings and temporary materials. Outside the practical routines of daily life, social and cultural activities also developed. Vietnamese traditions remained important for the refugee communities. Families celebrated holidays such as Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Even within the limited environment of the camps, decorations were created from simple materials and traditional foods were prepared when ingredients could be obtained. These celebrations helped maintain a connection to the culture and traditions that refugees had carried with them across the sea. Religious practices were also maintained. Small temples and churches became gathering places where residents prayed, reflected, and supported one another during difficult times. For many refugees, faith offered comfort during the long period of waiting. News from the outside world remained extremely important. Radios were sometimes shared among groups of families who gathered to listen to broadcasts about international events and refugee resettlement programs. Announcements from camp administrators were followed closely. Whenever representatives from resettlement countries arrived to conduct interviews, the information spread quickly throughout the camp. These interviews represented the most significant step toward leaving the island. Families prepared carefully when they received invitations. They reviewed their personal histories, gathered any documents they possessed, and hoped that the interview would result in approval for resettlement. Not every application succeeded. Some refugees were required to wait for additional review or apply through different immigration programs. These delays extended the time they spent living in the camps. Despite the uncertainty, the departure of approved families brought moments of celebration. When a family received confirmation that they would soon travel to a new country, neighbours gathered to congratulate them. The departing refugees packed their belongings once again, preparing for a journey very different from the one that had brought them across the sea. Instead of crowded boats, they would travel by airplane to distant cities around the world. Each departure reminded the remaining residents that their own turn might come soon. Life on the refugee islands, therefore, continued between two movements. A world begins to respond. As the number of Vietnamese refugees arriving in Southeast Asia continued to increase during the late 1970s, the situation gradually drew the attention of the international community. At first, the refugee arrivals had appeared as scattered reports. Small boats carrying families were reaching beaches in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Local authorities provided temporary assistance and transferred the refugees to camps while officials tried to determine what to do next. But as the years passed, the scale of the movement became impossible to ignore. Thousands of refugees were now reaching foreign shores each year. The camps that had been established as temporary solutions were growing rapidly. Islands that once held only small populations were now filled with tens of thousands of people waiting for resettlement. Governments across the region began raising concerns. Countries such as Malaysia and Thailand were already managing their own economic and social challenges. Providing food, water, and medical care for large refugee populations required significant resources. At the same time, the refugees themselves could not simply be sent back to sea. International humanitarian organizations had begun documenting the dangerous journeys the refugees had undertaken. Reports described overcrowded boats, long periods without adequate food or water, and encounters with pirates or severe weather. These stories circulated widely through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television reports. Images of refugee boats drifting across the sea or crowded camps on small islands reached audiences far beyond Southeast Asia. Many people around the world became aware that a major humanitarian situation was unfolding. International organizations began increasing their involvement. One of the most important groups working in the camps was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This agency was responsible for coordinating international assistance and helping governments manage refugee populations. UNHCR representatives visited the camps regularly. They worked with local authorities to improve living conditions and organize systems for registering new arrivals. Their teams also helped coordinate the resettlement process that would eventually allow refugees to move to other countries. Another major contributor was the International Red Cross. Medical teams from the Red Cross operated clinics in several refugee camps. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers treated illnesses and injuries while also monitoring sanitation and disease prevention. Aid from charitable organizations and religious groups also began to arrive. Church groups, humanitarian charities, and volunteer organizations from many countries sent supplies such as clothing, medicines, and educational materials for the refugees. Despite these efforts, the fundamental challenge remained. The camps were growing faster than refugees could be resettled. By the end of the 1970s, it was clear that a larger international plan would be necessary. In 1979, governments and international organizations gathered for an important conference in Geneva to address the growing refugee crisis. Representatives from many countries attended the meeting. The goal was to create a coordinated plan that would reduce the pressure on Southeast Asian countries while providing long-term solutions for the refugees. The discussions focused on two main issues. First, the countries that were receiving refugee boats needed support. Without assistance, they might close their borders entirely, leaving refugees with nowhere to land. Second, the refugees themselves needed opportunities to rebuild their lives in stable environments. During the conference, several nations agreed to expand their refugee resettlement programs. The United States announced that it would accept large numbers of Vietnamese refugees. Canada, Australia, France, and several European countries also committed to receiving thousands of people through organized immigration programs. These commitments marked a turning point. With more countries willing to accept refugees, the camps in Southeast Asia could begin processing departures more quickly. At the same time, efforts were made to regulate the departure of refugees from Vietnam. International negotiations eventually created programs that allowed some Vietnamese citizens to leave legally through organized migration channels. These programs helped reduce the need for dangerous sea voyages. However, the process took time to implement. Throughout the early 1980s, refugee boats continued arriving in Southeast Asia, although the international resettlement system gradually became more efficient. Inside the refugee camps, residents followed these developments closely. News about resettlement programs spread quickly through the communities. Families discussed which countries might accept them and what life in those places might be like. Many refugees had little information about the countries they hoped to enter. The United States, Canada, Australia, and France were far away and unfamiliar to most camp residents. Few people had travelled outside Southeast Asia before their journey across the sea. Nevertheless, the possibility of starting again in a new country created hope. Camp administrators began organising more structured interview programs. Officials from resettlement countries visited the camps and met with refugee families. They asked questions about education, employment experience, family connections, and the circumstances that had led to the refugees' departure from Vietnam. The interviews could determine whether a refugee family would be approved for relocation. For those who succeeded, the next stage of the journey involved preparation for departure. Families attended orientation sessions where they learned about the countries they would soon enter. They received basic information about language, employment, housing, and cultural differences. These sessions were often brief but important. They helped refugees prepare mentally for a major transition. Leaving the camps meant entering societies that operated very differently from the communities they had known in Vietnam. Many refugees would be moving to cities with unfamiliar climates, languages, and customs. Despite these uncertainties, approval for resettlement was greeted with gratitude. After years of waiting, the chance to begin a new life represented a significant turning point. Families packed their belongings once again. But this time the journey ahead would not involve crowded fishing boats or weeks at sea. Instead, they would board airplanes that would carry them across continents to places where Vietnamese communities would gradually begin to form. As the international response to the refugee crisis expanded, the story of the Vietnamese boat people moved into a new phase: departures from the islands. As the international resettlement programs expanded during the early 1980s, the refugee camps across Southeast Asia began to change in a noticeable way. For the first time since the camps had been established, large numbers of residents were not only arriving but also leaving. Each departure marked the end of one stage of the refugee journey and the beginning of another. The process of leaving the camps was carefully organised. Once a refugee family had been approved for resettlement by a receiving country, the camp administration began preparing them for travel. Lists were posted with the names of those who had been scheduled for departure, and word quickly spread through the camp whenever new announcements appeared. For the families whose names appeared on these lists, the moment carried many emotions. After months or years of waiting, they had finally reached the point where their lives would move forward again. The camp that had once seemed temporary had become a familiar environment. People had built friendships with neighbours, developed routines, and adapted to the daily rhythm of island life. Now it was time to leave that temporary world behind. Preparation for departure often began with additional interviews and paperwork. Officials confirmed personal details, verified family relationships, and ensured that all required documents were completed correctly. Medical examinations were also conducted to confirm that the travellers were healthy enough for international flights. The medical checks were usually straightforward. Doctors examined each refugee, checking for signs of infectious diseases and ensuring that necessary vaccinations had been administered. These procedures were important because the receiving countries required certain health standards for immigration. After the paperwork and medical requirements were completed, families attended orientation sessions. These sessions were designed to introduce refugees to the countries where they would soon live. Representatives from immigration agencies or humanitarian organizations explained basic information about housing, employment, education, and cultural customs. Many refugees listened carefully to these brief lessons. The countries they were about to enter were often very different from the places they had known before. Some families were preparing to move to large American cities. Others would settle in Canadian towns, Australian suburbs, or communities in France and other parts of Europe. The languages spoken in those countries were unfamiliar to many of the refugees. English was the most common language taught during orientation sessions because several major resettlement countries used it as their primary language. Basic phrases and simple vocabulary were introduced to help refugees communicate after arrival. Although the lessons were brief, they provided an important introduction to the environments awaiting them. Once preparations were complete, the day of departure arrived. Transportation from the camps to international airports was organized by humanitarian agencies working together with local governments. Groups of departing refugees were gathered and placed on boats or buses depending on the location of the camp. For those leaving island camps such as Pulau Bidong or Galang, the journey began with a short boat ride back to the mainland. These trips across the water were very different from the earlier voyages that had brought refugees across the sea. The boats were organized transportation vessels rather than crowded fishing boats, and the journey lasted only a short time. Nevertheless, for many refugees, the movement across water once again reminded them of the path their lives had taken. From the mainland, buses transported the refugees to nearby airports. For many families, this was the first time they had ever seen a large airport or an airplane up close. The scale of modern air travel was unfamiliar to people who had spent years living in simple shelters on small islands. Airplanes represented a dramatic change from the small boats that had carried them across the sea. Instead of wooden decks and open water, they now sat inside enclosed cabins where seats were arranged in rows. Flight attendants explained safety procedures, and the engines produced a steady sound as the aircraft prepared for departure. The journey that had once required weeks of travel by sea could now be completed in a matter of hours. Flights carried the refugees across oceans and continents to the countries that had agreed to receive them. The United States became the largest destination for Vietnamese refugees during this period. Cities such as Los Angeles, Houston, San Jose, and New Orleans eventually developed large Vietnamese communities as new arrivals settled there. Canada also accepted significant numbers of refugees. Many Vietnamese families began new lives in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Canadian sponsorship programs allowed private citizens, religious organizations, and community groups to assist refugee families as they adapted to their new surroundings. Australia welcomed many Vietnamese refugees as well. Communities formed in cities including Sydney and Melbourne, where immigrants gradually established businesses, cultural centres, and religious institutions. France had a long historical connection with Vietnam dating back to the colonial period, and it also received a considerable number of refugees. Vietnamese communities developed in Paris and other French cities. Each country created programs to help refugees begin their new lives. Temporary housing was often provided during the first weeks after arrival. Language classes were organised to help new immigrants learn the local language. Employment assistance programs helped refugees find work suited to their skills and experience. The adjustment process required time and patience. Many refugees arrived with limited financial resources and little familiarity with the culture of their new countries. The climate, food, transportation systems, and daily routines were all different from what they had known before. Learning a new language became one of the most important challenges. Adults attended language classes while also searching for employment. Children usually adapted more quickly through school, where they learned new languages while forming friendships with classmates. Despite the difficulties, Vietnamese refugees gradually began building stable communities in their new homes. Neighborhoods with Vietnamese restaurants, markets, temples, and churches appeared in many cities around the world. These places helped preserve cultural traditions while also providing support for newly arrived families. For the refugees who had once crowded the small camps of Southeast Asia, these growing communities represented the beginning of a new chapter, beginning again in new countries. When Vietnamese refugees arrived in their new countries during the late 1970s and 1980s, they stepped into environments that were very different from the places they had known before. The journey that had begun with quiet departures from the Vietnamese coastline had now carried them across oceans to distant cities. Many refugees had never travelled outside Southeast Asia before their resettlement flights. Now they were arriving in places where the language, climate, food, and daily routines were unfamiliar. For most families, the first stage of life in their new country began in temporary housing, arranged by government agencies or community sponsorship programs. In the United States, refugee resettlement organizations coordinated housing placements in many cities. Some families stayed briefly in apartments provided by these programs while they began learning how to navigate their new surroundings. In Canada, private sponsorship programs played a significant role. Groups of citizens, churches, and community organizations volunteered to support refugee families during their first year in the country. Sponsors helped new arrivals find housing, enroll children in school, and learn how to access public services. Australia and several European countries developed similar programs. The goal in each case was to help refugees transition from the temporary environment of the camps to the responsibilities of independent life. One of the most immediate challenges was language. Many refugees arrived with little knowledge of English or other local languages. Communication during the first weeks relied heavily on translators, bilingual volunteers, or family members who had some prior education in foreign languages. Language classes quickly became an important part of daily life. Adult refugees attended lessons organized by local community centers, schools, or immigrant support organizations. These classes focused on practical communication skills that would help newcomers navigate everyday tasks. Students learned how to introduce themselves, ask for directions, read transportation schedules, and complete basic forms. Although the process required patience, progress often came steadily. Children typically learn new languages more quickly through school. Within a few years, many Vietnamese refugee children were fluent in English, French, or other languages spoken in their new homes. Education played a major role in helping refugee families adjust. Children were enrolled in local schools soon after arrival. Teachers and administrators worked to support students who were entering classrooms with very different educational backgrounds. Special language programs were often created to help these students integrate into regular classes. For the children, school also became a place where they built new friendships. Although cultural differences sometimes created challenges, shared classroom experiences gradually helped bridge those gaps. While children adapted to school life, adults focused on employment. Many refugees arrived with valuable skills and education. Some had been teachers, engineers, doctors, or business owners in Vietnam. Others had experience in farming, construction, or mechanical trades. However, professional credentials from Vietnam were not always recognized immediately in their new countries. As a result, many refugees accepted entry-level jobs during their first years abroad. They worked in factories, restaurants, small businesses, and service industries, while continuing to improve their language skills and adjust to the new economic systems around them. These early jobs were often demanding. Refugee families understood that rebuilding their lives required determination and patience. Parents worked long hours while also supporting their children's education and adapting to unfamiliar social systems. Despite the challenges, progress gradually appeared. Savings accumulated slowly, allowing families to move from temporary housing into permanent homes. Small businesses began to open within Vietnamese communities. Restaurants serving traditional Vietnamese food appeared in many cities. Grocery stores stocked ingredients familiar to Vietnamese cooking. Bakeries prepared traditional breads and pastries. These businesses not only supported economic stability, but also helped maintain cultural traditions. Religious institutions were established as well. Buddhist temples and Catholic churches became important gathering places for Vietnamese communities. These institutions provided spiritual support and also served as centers for cultural activities and community organization. Over time, Vietnamese neighborhoods began forming in several major cities. In California, the area known as Little Saigon in Orange County became one of the largest Vietnamese communities outside Vietnam itself. Similar neighborhoods developed in Houston, San Jose, and other American cities. Canada, Australia, and France also saw the growth of Vietnamese cultural centers and neighborhoods. These communities offered newcomers a sense of familiarity. Vietnamese language newspapers appeared, providing news and information for readers who were still adjusting to new languages. Community festivals celebrated traditional holidays such as the Lunar New Year. These events allowed families to maintain connections to their heritage while living in new cultural environments. The younger generation played an important role in bridging two worlds. Children who had grown up in refugee camps or who had arrived at a young age often became fluent in both Vietnamese and the language of their new country. They acted as translators for their parents and helped navigate systems such as schools, banks, and government offices. As these children grew older, many pursued higher education. Universities welcomed students from refugee backgrounds who had worked hard to succeed in their new environments. Some studied medicine, engineering, law, and business, building professional careers that would shape the future of their communities. The Vietnamese diaspora gradually expanded its presence in many fields. Entrepreneurs opened companies, scholars contributed to academic research, and artists shared Vietnamese culture through literature, music, and film. These achievements reflected the resilience of families who had once travelled across the sea with little more than hope for a safer future. At the same time, memories of the refugee journey remained important within these communities. Many families continued to tell stories about the difficult voyages that had carried them away from Vietnam. The sea crossings, the refugee camps, and the years of waiting became shared experiences that shaped their collective identity. These memories were preserved through family histories, community gatherings, and cultural organizations. They reminded younger generations of the path their parents and grandparents had taken. The Vietnamese boat people had once been a population defined by uncertainty and displacement, but as the years passed, they became part of new societies across the world while maintaining strong connections to their heritage. Their journey was no longer only a story of escape. It had become a story of rebuilding communities across the world. As Vietnamese refugees gradually settled into their new countries during the 1980s and early 1990s, the scattered families who had once travelled across the sea began forming stable communities in many parts of the world. These communities did not appear overnight. They developed slowly as new arrivals joined relatives, friends, and earlier immigrants who had already begun establishing homes and businesses. Over time, Vietnamese cultural life took root in cities thousands of miles from the rivers and villages of Vietnam. In the United States, the largest Vietnamese populations formed in several key regions. California became home to one of the most visible Vietnamese communities. In Orange County, south of Los Angeles, refugees began opening small shops and restaurants that served traditional foods from their homeland. Markets sold rice, herbs, fish sauce, and other ingredients essential to Vietnamese cooking. As more families arrived, the neighborhood expanded. Storefronts displayed Vietnamese language signs, and community newspapers began publishing news relevant to Vietnamese readers. Over time, this area became widely known as Little Saigon. Little Saigon developed into a major cultural center. Visitors could find bookstores, bakeries, clothing shops, temples, and restaurants, all reflecting Vietnamese traditions. Cultural festivals were organized each year, bringing thousands of people together to celebrate holidays such as Tet, the Lunar New Year. The growth of Little Saigon represented more than just economic activity. It provided a place where refugees could preserve their language, customs, and traditions while adapting to life in a new country. Similar communities appeared in other American cities. Houston, Texas, became another important center for Vietnamese immigrants. Many refugees found work in the fishing industry along the Gulf Coast, while others opened restaurants and small businesses throughout the city. San Jose in Northern California also developed a large Vietnamese population. The region's expanding technology industry provided employment opportunities and new neighborhoods filled with Vietnamese markets and cultural organizations. Across the United States, Vietnamese communities continued growing throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Community associations formed to support education, social services, and cultural preservation. Vietnamese language newspapers and radio stations helped residents stay connected to news both in their new country and abroad. Canada experienced a similar pattern. Cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal became home to Vietnamese refugee families who had arrived through government and private sponsorship programs. In these cities, Vietnamese restaurants and grocery stores began appearing in neighborhoods where immigrant communities gathered. Cultural centers organized language classes for children born in Canada. These classes allowed younger generations to learn Vietnamese while growing up in an English or French-speaking environment. Maintaining bilingual skills helped children communicate with older family members, while also strengthening cultural identity. Australia also became a major destination for Vietnamese refugees. Sydney and Melbourne saw significant growth in Vietnamese communities. Markets, temples, and restaurants developed in neighbourhoods where refugees settled. Cabramatta, a suburb of Sydney, became one of the most recognisable Vietnamese neighbourhoods in Australia. Streets filled with Vietnamese businesses created an atmosphere similar to the markets of Southeast Asia. Restaurants served traditional dishes such as pho, banh mi, and rice noodle soups that quickly became popular among people from many different backgrounds. France, which had historical connections with Vietnam dating back to the colonial period, also welcomed many refugees. Paris and several other French cities developed Vietnamese communities where cultural traditions continued to flourish. Vietnamese bakeries, restaurants, and cultural associations contributed to the diverse life of these urban areas. In each of these countries, Vietnamese refugees contributed to the local economy in many ways. Small businesses were often the first step toward economic stability. Restaurants became particularly successful because Vietnamese cuisine offered flavors that attracted a wide range of customers. Dishes such as pho, fresh spring rolls, and grilled meats introduced many people to Vietnamese culinary traditions. Over time, Vietnamese entrepreneurs expanded into other industries. Grocery stores imported ingredients used in Southeast Asian cooking. Tailoring shops, nail salons, and service businesses appeared in neighborhoods across many cities. The nail salon industry in particular became closely associated with Vietnamese entrepreneurship in North America. Many Vietnamese immigrants entered this field because it offered opportunities for training and business ownership, even for those still learning English. Over time, Vietnamese technicians and business owners became a significant part of the nail salon workforce in the United States and Canada. Education also played an important role in the growth of these communities. Parents who had endured years of uncertainty in refugee camps often placed great emphasis on their children's schooling. They believed strongly that education would provide the stability and opportunity they had once sought when leaving Vietnam. As a result, many Vietnamese students pursued higher education. Universities across the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe welcomed students from Vietnamese refugee backgrounds who went on to study fields such as medicine, engineering, law, and business. These achievements gradually reshaped the public perception of Vietnamese immigrants. What had once been seen primarily as a refugee population became recognized as a dynamic community contributing to many aspects of society. Cultural traditions continued to play a central role. Temples and churches served as gathering places where families celebrated important holidays and ceremonies. Vietnamese language schools operated on weekends, helping children maintain connections to their heritage. Music, literature, and art also reflected the experiences of the refugee generation. Writers and filmmakers shared stories about the journeys across the sea and the lives rebuilt in distant countries. These works helped preserve historical memory while also introducing Vietnamese culture to broader audiences. At the same time, connections with Vietnam itself slowly evolved. During the early years after the war, travel between Vietnam and the diaspora communities was limited. Over time, however, diplomatic relations and economic reforms in Vietnam created opportunities for renewed contact. Some refugees eventually visited the country they had left behind many years earlier. These visits allowed families to reconnect with relatives and observe how Vietnam had changed since their departure. The Vietnamese diaspora had grown into a global network. From California to Sydney, from Paris to Toronto, communities continued building lives shaped by both memory and adaptation. What began as a desperate escape across dangerous seas had gradually become the foundation for a worldwide cultural presence. New lives in unfamiliar places. By the mid-1980s, the movement that had once consisted of small wooden boats crossing the sea had transformed into something much larger and more complex. Vietnamese refugees who had arrived in new countries were beginning to build ordinary lives again, though the path towards stability was rarely simple. For many families, the first years after resettlement required constant adjustment. Cities in North America, Europe, and Australia often looked very different from the places refugees had known in Vietnam. Streets were wider, buildings taller, and transportation systems far more complex. Winters in Canada or the northern United States introduced temperatures and snow that many refugees had never experienced before. The climate alone required careful adaptation. Families learned how to prepare for cold weather, purchasing coats, gloves, and heating supplies. Children walking to school in winter sometimes experienced snow for the first time in their lives. What began as unfamiliar eventually became part of normal daily routines. Housing arrangements were another early challenge. Refugee families often began their new lives in small apartments provided through resettlement programs. These apartments were usually located in urban neighborhoods where public transportation, schools, and social services were easily accessible. The spaces were modest but stable. For people who had once slept on crowded boats or inside temporary shelters in refugee camps, having a permanent roof overhead carried deep meaning. Furniture was gradually collected through donations or purchased as families began earning income. Kitchens were stocked with basic supplies, and living rooms slowly filled with items that reflected both Vietnamese culture and the new environment surrounding them. Employment became one of the most important parts of rebuilding life. Many refugees took the first jobs that were available, regardless of whether the work matched their previous careers. Factories, restaurants, warehouses, and small retail shops provided opportunities to earn income while learning the language and culture of their new country. These jobs often required long hours. Parents worked multiple shifts while also attending language classes and helping their children adjust to school. The determination to provide stability for the next generation became a strong motivation for many families. Children usually adapted more quickly to the new environment. Schools introduced them to new languages, social customs, and educational opportunities. Teachers often recognized that refugee students faced unusual challenges, and many schools created programs to help them transition successfully. Over time, these students began achieving strong academic results. Some of the children who had once lived in refugee camps later entered universities and pursued careers in medicine, engineering, science, and law. Their success became an important part of the story of Vietnamese refugee communities. Cultural identity remained important throughout this process. Families continued speaking Vietnamese at home, preserving traditions that had been passed down for generations. Meals often included familiar foods, prepared with ingredients purchased from Vietnamese markets. These markets became essential gathering places within the growing communities. Shops selling rice noodles, fresh herbs, fish sauce, and tropical fruits allowed families to maintain the flavors of their homeland. Restaurant owners introduced Vietnamese cuisine to customers who had never tasted it before. Pho, the traditional Vietnamese noodle soup, gradually became known around the world. Its combination of broth, herbs, and rice noodles attracted people from many different cultures. Over time, Vietnamese restaurants became common in cities across North America, Europe, and Australia. Religious life also continued to play a central role. Buddhist temples and Catholic churches served as community centers where families gathered for prayer, ceremonies, and social support. Religious leaders helped refugees maintain spiritual traditions while adjusting to their new surroundings. Community organizations also developed to support newcomers. Volunteer groups helped refugees find employment, enroll in education programs, and navigate government services. These organizations were often created by earlier Vietnamese immigrants who understood the challenges faced by new arrivals. Festivals became important events for preserving cultural heritage. Each year, celebrations of the Lunar New Year brought communities together for music, traditional food, and cultural performances. Lion dances, lantern displays, and traditional clothing filled community halls and outdoor markets. These events also introduced Vietnamese traditions to people from other cultures. Neighbors and visitors attended the celebrations, learning about customs that had traveled across oceans along with the refugee families. The growth of Vietnamese communities gradually influenced the cities where they settled. Local economies benefited from new businesses and cultural diversity. Restaurants, markets, and service industries created employment opportunities and enriched the social fabric of neighborhoods. In many places, Vietnamese became one of the most widely spoken immigrant languages. Schools offered Vietnamese language programs, and cultural organizations published newspapers and books that preserved historical memory. The experiences of the refugee generation were often shared through stories told within families. Parents described the difficult decisions that had led them to leave Vietnam. They remembered the crowded boats, the uncertain sea voyages, and the years spent waiting in refugee camps. These stories were not always told dramatically. Instead, they were shared quietly, often during family gatherings or conversations between parents and children. For younger generations born in their new countries, these memories provided a connection to a past they had never personally experienced. The journey of the Vietnamese boat people had reshaped countless lives. What had once been a desperate migration across dangerous seas gradually evolved into a global diaspora. Communities spread across continents while maintaining strong cultural ties to their heritage. Even decades later, the impact of that migration could still be seen. Restaurants serving Vietnamese cuisine appeared in cities around the world. Vietnamese students and professionals contributed to many fields, from science and medicine to art and technology. Behind these achievements remained the memory of the long journey that had made them possible. The small boats that once crossed the South China Sea had carried more than passengers, the last boats. By the late 1980s, the large waves of Vietnamese refugees leaving by sea began to slow, though the journey had not yet completely ended. During the previous decade, hundreds of thousands of people had departed Vietnam on small boats. Many had reached refugee camps across Southeast Asia, and large numbers had already been resettled in countries around the world. The international programs created in response to the refugee crisis had begun to reduce the pressure that once filled the camps. Yet departures from Vietnam still continued. Some families remained determined to leave because their relatives had already settled abroad. Others still believed that opportunities outside Vietnam would provide greater stability for the future. At the same time, Vietnam itself was beginning to change. In the mid-1980s, the Vietnamese government introduced a series of economic reforms known as Doi Moi. These reforms gradually shifted the country toward a more flexible economic system, allowing greater private business activity and increased trade with other nations. The reforms did not transform conditions overnight, but they slowly improved the economic environment. Markets reopened in many cities, agricultural production increased, and trade relationships with other countries expanded. These changes began influencing the decisions of families who had once considered leaving. For many people, the possibility of rebuilding their lives within Vietnam now appeared more realistic. Meanwhile, the international community continued working to manage the refugee situation in Southeast Asia. By the end of the 1980s, Governments in the region were concerned that the refugee camps had become long-term settlements rather than temporary shelters. Large populations had lived there for years, and new arrivals continued to appear. In response, a major international agreement was developed. In 1989, representatives from many countries met once again to address the ongoing refugee crisis. The result was a policy known as the Comprehensive Plan of Action. The plan introduced several new measures. First, Vietnamese refugees arriving after a certain date would undergo screening to determine whether they qualified for refugee status. Those recognized as refugees would continue to receive opportunities for resettlement in other countries. Those who did not meet the criteria would eventually return to Vietnam under organized repatriation programs. The plan also expanded legal migration channels that allowed Vietnamese citizens to leave the country through official processes rather than dangerous sea voyages. These policies gradually reduced the number of people attempting to escape by boat. At the same time, the Vietnamese government cooperated with international agencies to facilitate legal emigration programs. Families with relatives abroad could apply to leave through official procedures. These programs offered a safer alternative to the sea journeys that had defined the earlier years of the refugee movement. Throughout the early 1990s, the number of new boat departures declined significantly. Refugee camps across Southeast Asia began closing as their populations decreased. Residents who had been approved for resettlement travelled to their new countries, while others returned to Vietnam through voluntary repatriation programs. Pulau Bidong, once one of the most crowded refugee camps in the region, gradually emptied. The wooden shelters that had once housed thousands of people were dismantled. Buildings that had served as schools, clinics, and administrative offices were slowly abandoned as the refugee population declined. Galang Island in Indonesia followed a similar path. The camp that had once served as a temporary home for many Vietnamese refugees eventually closed its operations. Some of its structures were later preserved as historical reminders of the migration that had passed through the island. By the mid-1990s, the era of the Vietnamese boat people was largely coming to an end. The last groups of refugees left the remaining camps, either departing for resettlement countries or returning to Vietnam. For the families who had spent years living in those camps, the final departures carried mixed emotions. The camps had never been intended as permanent homes, yet they had become places where children grew up, friendships formed, and communities developed. Leaving them meant moving forward once again into uncertain futures. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese diaspora around the world continued expanding. Communities established during the previous decades had grown stronger and more organized. Businesses, cultural institutions, and social networks provided support for new immigrants arriving through legal migration programs. Cities such as Los Angeles, Houston, Toronto, Sydney, and Paris now contained vibrant Vietnamese neighborhoods where traditions and modern life existed side by side. In these communities, memories of the boat journeys remained powerful. Many families continued to share stories about the sea crossings that had shaped their lives. The long nights on crowded boats, the uncertainty of drifting across open water, and the relief of reaching land all became part of family history. Younger generations learned these stories from parents and grandparents. Some had been children during the voyages. Others had been born later in refugee camps or in the new countries where their families settled. For them, the story of the Vietnamese boat people represented both hardship and resilience. It was a reminder of the difficult path their families had taken in search of safety and opportunity. By the time the final refugee camps closed in the 1990s, historians and humanitarian organizations began reflecting on the scale of the migration. Over 1 million Vietnamese people had left the country during the years following the war. Many had crossed the sea in small boats, facing dangers that included storms, mechanical failures, piracy, and long periods without adequate food or water. Thousands of lives had been lost during those journeys, yet hundreds of thousands had survived and rebuilt their lives in countries around the world. The era of the boat people had reshaped communities across multiple continents. What began as a desperate movement of families fleeing uncertainty had gradually evolved into a global diaspora that contributed to many societies. And although the final refugee boats eventually disappeared from the waters of the South China Sea, the legacy of those voyages continued through the lives of the people who had once stepped aboard them. By the time the large refugee camps of Southeast Asia had closed, and the last major waves of boat departures had faded, the story of the Vietnamese boat people had already become part of modern history. Yet for the individuals and families who had lived through those years, the experiences did not remain simply as historical events. They remained as memories carried quietly across continents. Throughout the Vietnamese diaspora, the memories of departure, sea journeys and refugee camps continued to shape the identity of communities that had formed in new countries. These memories were often shared within families first. Parents spoke about the difficult decisions they had faced during the years after the war. They remembered selling their possessions, gathering gold, and leaving their homes late at night to reach the small boats waiting along rivers or hidden coastal docks. Many of these stories were told gradually. Children who had grown up in North America, Europe, or Australia sometimes heard only fragments when they were young. As they grew older, their parents and grandparents explained more about the reasons that had led their families to leave Vietnam. These conversations helped younger generations understand the sacrifices that had shaped their lives. The sea journey itself remained one of the most powerful parts of these family memories. People remembered the crowded decks of wooden boats, the long hours surrounded by open water, and the uncertainty that accompanied each day of travel. Some families recalled moments when storms threatened to overwhelm their vessels. Others remembered drifting for days when engines failed or fuel ran out, encounters with pirates, shortages of food and water, and the constant search for land became shared experiences among those who had travelled during those years. By the time the 20th century approached its final years, the migration of the Vietnamese boat people had already reshaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of families. What had once been a desperate movement of refugees leaving their homeland by sea had gradually become one of the most widely recognized refugee stories of the modern era. The legacy of that migration extended far beyond the years when boats crossed the South China Sea. It lived on in the communities that former refugees built in cities around the world. These communities became places where Vietnamese culture, language, and traditions continued to flourish while also adapting to new environments. One of the most visible parts of this legacy appeared in the growth of Vietnamese cultural neighborhoods. In many cities, streets that had once contained only a few immigrant businesses gradually transformed into vibrant commercial areas filled with Vietnamese restaurants, markets, and cultural centers. In the United States, the district known as Little Saigon in California became a symbol of this transformation. What began as a small cluster of refugee-owned shops eventually grew into a large cultural and economic center. Visitors could walk along streets lined with restaurants serving pho and other traditional dishes, bakeries offering Vietnamese pastries, and stores selling books and music from Vietnamese artists. Community centers hosted cultural events, language classes, and educational programs designed to preserve Vietnamese heritage. The growth of these neighborhoods demonstrated how refugee communities could rebuild their lives while maintaining strong connections to their cultural identity. Similar developments appeared in other countries. In Canada, Vietnamese cultural festivals became regular events in cities such as Toronto and Vancouver. Markets offering Vietnamese foods and goods attracted customers from many different cultural backgrounds. In Australia, suburbs such as Cabramatta in Sydney became well known for their Vietnamese communities. Restaurants, temples, and community organisations helped preserve traditions that had travelled across the sea with the refugee generation. In France, Vietnamese cultural associations organised exhibitions, music performances, and language programs that reflected the long historical connection between the two countries. Across Europe, North America, and Australia, Vietnamese communities continued contributing to the cultural diversity of the societies where they had settled. Education played a particularly important role in shaping the legacy of the refugee generation. Parents who had endured the uncertainty of sea voyages and refugee camps often placed strong emphasis on their children's academic success. They encouraged their children to pursue higher education and professional careers that could provide stability for the future. Over time, many Vietnamese students achieved significant academic success. Universities welcomed growing numbers of students from Vietnamese backgrounds who excelled in fields such as engineering, medicine, law, and business. These achievements reflected both the determination of the students and the sacrifices made by their parents during the years of migration. The professional success of Vietnamese immigrants also expanded into entrepreneurship. Small businesses established during the early years of resettlement gradually grew into larger enterprises. Vietnamese entrepreneurs opened companies in industries ranging from food service and retail to technology and healthcare. The nail salon industry became particularly associated with Vietnamese entrepreneurship in several countries. Training programs and family networks helped many Vietnamese immigrants establish successful businesses in this field. Over time, these businesses provided employment opportunities not only for Vietnamese workers, but also for people from other communities. In addition to economic contributions, Vietnamese communities played an important role in cultural exchange. Food, music, literature, and art introduced Vietnamese traditions to audiences around the world. Vietnamese cuisine became especially popular internationally. Dishes such as pho, banh mi sandwiches, and fresh spring rolls appeared on menus in cities across many continents. These foods reflected the culinary traditions that refugees had carried with them during their journeys. Cultural festivals celebrating Vietnamese traditions also attracted broad participation. Events marking the Lunar New Year included traditional music, dance performances, and colourful decorations that introduced visitors to Vietnamese cultural heritage. These celebrations helped strengthen community bonds while also sharing cultural traditions with neighbours from other backgrounds. The story of the Vietnamese boat people also influenced international discussions about refugee protection. Humanitarian organisations studied the migration as an example of how international cooperation could respond to large refugee crises. Programs developed during the boat people era helped shape later policies for assisting refugees in other parts of the world. The experiences of Vietnamese refugees demonstrated the importance of coordinated international responses involving governments, humanitarian agencies, and community organisations. The migration also highlighted the resilience of individuals and families who had faced extraordinary challenges. Despite leaving their homeland under dangerous circumstances, many refugees succeeded in rebuilding their lives and contributing positively to their new societies. At the same time, the memories of the journey remained important. Within Vietnamese communities, the history of the boat people was preserved through storytelling, literature, and educational programs. Younger generations learned about the experiences of their parents and grandparents, gaining a deeper understanding of the sacrifices that had made their own opportunities possible. In schools and universities, scholars examined the migration as part of the broader history of global refugee movements. Documentaries and books recorded personal testimonies from survivors, ensuring that the experiences of the boat people would remain part of historical memory. Memorials established in several countries honoured those who had lost their lives during the sea voyages. These memorials served as quiet reminders of the dangers faced by families who had crossed the ocean in search of safety. They also represented the resilience of those who survived. Today, the descendants of the Vietnamese boat people live in many countries across the world. They work as teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, business owners, and community leaders. Their achievements reflect the strength of communities that once began with little more than determination and hope. The migration that began with small wooden boats crossing the sea had grown into a global story of resilience, adaptation, and cultural continuity, the sea and the memory. By the time the final refugee camps closed and the last major waves of Vietnamese boat departures ended in the 1990s, the movement had already become one of the most widely remembered refugee migrations of the 20th century. The boats that once crossed the South China Sea had largely disappeared, but the memory of those journeys remained alive in the communities formed by the people who had taken them. For the families who had left Vietnam during those years, the sea was not simply a geographical feature. It was the place where their lives had changed direction. Many survivors remembered the moment when their boats first moved away from the Vietnamese coastline. The land that had been familiar since childhood slowly faded into the distance, replaced by open water that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The decision to step onto those small boats had never been simple. Families left behind homes, relatives, and communities that had shaped their lives for generations. Yet they carried with them the belief that somewhere beyond the sea they might find safety and stability. The journeys that followed were often long and uncertain. Small wooden boats drifted across wide stretches of water, with limited supplies and aging engines. Passengers faced storms, mechanical breakdowns, and the constant possibility that they might never reach land. Some boats travelled only a few days before reaching the shores of Southeast Asia. Others drifted much longer before rescue ships or distant coastlines appeared. For those who survived the journey, the first sight of land often marked the beginning of a completely new chapter. Refugee camps on islands such as Pulau Bidong and Galang became temporary homes where families waited for the next stage of their lives to unfold. Years passed there while international programs arranged resettlement to countries around the world. Eventually, many of those families boarded airplanes that carried them far beyond Southeast Asia. They arrived in cities across North America, Europe, and Australia, where they began rebuilding their lives step by step. The story we've explored tonight stretches across oceans and decades. It begins with quiet departures along the rivers and coastlines of Vietnam, continues across the wide waters of the South China Sea, and eventually settles in neighbourhoods and communities around the world. For many families, those journeys were filled with uncertainty, yet they also carried hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, a new life might be possible. Today, the descendants of the Vietnamese boat people live in many different countries. They work in hospitals, schools, businesses, and community organisations. They celebrate traditions passed down through generations, while also building lives shaped by new cultures and languages. The memories of the sea journeys remain important. They remind families of the courage and determination that guided their ancestors through one of the most difficult migrations of modern history. At the same time, those memories are balanced by the quieter realities of everyday life: children attending school, families sharing meals, and communities celebrating cultural traditions together. History often focuses on large events and dramatic moments. But the story of the boat people also reminds us that history is built from individual lives, each shaped by choices, challenges, and perseverance. And now, as the night grows quieter, we can allow that long journey to gently fade into the background. The sea becomes calm again. The boats have long since reached their destinations. Families rest in homes far from the waters where their journeys began. So for now, let the mind grow still. Let the story settle softly into the quiet, and allow sleep to arrive naturally.